Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome. Many of you know me, but for those of you who don't, I'm Freya Hartzell. I'm probably getting a little too loud here. I'm Associate Professor of Design History here at Bard Graduate Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is part of our Françoise and Georges Selz Endowed Lecture Series in 18th and 19th century French decorative arts and culture. It's a huge, huge pleasure for me to introduce you to someone that I've been lucky enough to get to know a little bit in the context of my project on dolls and human likeness. Kathy Libraty is a Renaissance woman. She began restoring and dealing in antique dolls in 1990, and as she says herself, she never looked back. 35 years later, she is a celebrated antique doll specialist, an avid doll collector, and a prominent doll dealer. She's also an art photographer, a poet, and a singer-songwriter. Born in France, Kathy maintains a strong connection to France and French culture and frequently travels to Paris for work and I'm sure pleasure as well. And recently she told me she's been translating her poetry from English into French, so there's a very strong French connection there. Tonight, Kathy's going to share with us her expertise on the French Poupée, the grown-up lady fashion doll of the 1870s, and then the rise in the 1880s of the child doll, the bébé. But the evolution from poupée to bébé is not simply a story about playthings, it's also about the history of fashion, the development of industry, and important shifts in domestic culture. In their deceptively diminutive packages, these dolls draw together a wide array of topics and issues central to the BGC's commitment to learning through things. Dolls are generally overlooked in object-oriented histories, but if we choose to take them seriously, dolls can show us innovative approaches and offer us important new evidence in our ongoing study of the decorative arts, design history, and material culture. So let's start taking dolls seriously right now by welcoming doll expert Kathy Libraty.
Hello, hello, everybody. Well, I don't have to tell you my name because Freya just did. But let me talk to you about some dolls. I love antique dolls, and I have a question for you. Are you afraid of dolls? Come on, let's be honest. I see some people in the audience are. Well, have you ever encountered a doll collector and asked him if he's not afraid that the dolls might attack him in his sleep? Or maybe you met an elderly doll enthusiast and thought, that old Biddy has some screws loose. Well, that is not an uncommon reaction to individuals who amass large collections of dolls. I know, I am a card-carrying member of that club. And I blame it on the film industry. Films like Chucky, like Dolly Dearest, Dolls, Blood Dolls, Robert and the Toymaker, Annabelle. And while I personally have never had the desire to view any of these films, I understand the creep factor. But let me tell you a short story that triggered my own fear of dolls at an early age and eventually my love of dolls in adulthood. It has to do with a formative experience of my childhood. I was 3 years old, riding in the back of a taxi in Paris with my 5-year-old sister. My mom was in the front seat with the driver, periodically turning her head. Oh, by the way, I'm the cute one. She was casting some nasty glances at us, and she was like really upset because recently my Uncle Maurice had given us 2 dolls. They were like Bill Lilly's, the precursors of the Barbie dolls. Her doll had a beautiful blonde mane. My doll had black hair. And I decided that her doll was much more beautiful than mine. and I was determined to get that doll. So we were fighting in the back of the car. The taxi came to a halt. There were the two dolls. Those are not the exact dolls, but they were a close facsimile. Taxi came to a halt. My mother jumps out of the car, grabs the two of us, says to us, "Hand over the dolls." We give her the dolls, and guess what happens? She decides that there's a taxi in Paris. She's going to break their heads off and throw them in the trash. I'm sorry if this makes you feel bad, but I have forgiven her since. She turned to us and pronounced that we would never be allowed to play with dolls again. This film clip really played in my head for most of my childhood. Flash forward 30 years, and one day while I was riding in the back of a van, isn't it interesting that I'm always in a moving vehicle when something absolutely life-changing occurs? My husband and I passed by an old house with a dumpster in front. There was a burly old man hurling furniture and boxes full of interesting antiques that he was tossing into that dumpster with no regard to damaging them. There were old frames, porcelain lamps, beautiful chinaware, velvet cushions, and boxes full of household items. As I was viewing from my high perch on the van, I spotted doll legs and a cracked porcelain head in one of the boxes. I asked the man if he didn't mind if he was discarding them and if he didn't mind if I was allowed to take the box with the dolls. He scoffed, but with a signal, he motioned to take the box, and my husband grabbed the box. So there was this broken doll in the box. We were both starting a small antiques business at the time, and we knew that the items that were being thrown away might have some value. We returned later that day to find that the neighbors had emptied the dumpster. That was the beginning of my love affair with antique dolls. I was bitten by the doll bug. I repaired the broken doll, which turned out to be a German doll by George Borgfeld, produced in 1890 to 1905. This is not the exact doll, but it is a George Borgfeld. For the next decade, I taught myself how to repair and restore antique dolls. So that's me now repairing dolls. But that's basically what I taught myself over the years, and I still do doll restoration, and I still love antique dolls, and I feel that they deserve to be saved for history. And it's very fun, like finding a broken doll, a basket case, and bringing her back to her original glory. I learned that the most desirable antique dolls were the French bébés, the French fashion dolls. My mission became clear. I had to have a jumeau bébé. We introduced antique dolls to our small but growing antique business and began selling them by mail order. This was before the e-commerce situation. Eventually, we earned enough money to buy a jumeau doll. This brings us to the topic of my lecture tonight. Following mostly the French jumeau firm, I will elaborate on the celebrated French fashion dolls as ambassadors of la mode parisienne to the evolution of the French bébé doll. Those are some fashion dolls from a book on fashion dolls by Marie Tarnowska. The French bébé doll is not only an objet de vertu in the latter 19th century French doll market, but also as an object targeted to the children's realm of play and domestic education. Here are old photographs of Victorian children with antique dolls, and these were probably taken in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. The one over there on the right might be a little later. This was part of my education on the antique dolls. I wanted to know how they were dressed, and you can see a lot of them may have been dressed by the mother or the child itself. The one in the middle is a jumeau bébé. The one on the left is probably a wax over German paper mache, and the one on the right is a German dolly. I'm really intrigued by the photographs of these children holding the dolls. So I want to talk to you about Pierre-François Jumeau, who was the founder of the Jumeau firm in the 1840s. He produced papier-mâché dolls, then transitioned to bisque-head fashion dolls. With his son at the helm in the 1870s, he finally got to producing the bébé dolls. But we're going to spend some time on Pierre-François because he really was an innovator. And some more postcards. Here he is. And he really was one of the biggest doll makers in Europe in that period. So when he transitioned from the fashion dolls with his son in the 1870s, we'll talk about that later. But this period highlights the golden age of doll making in Europe and reflects changing views of childhood as the Industrial Revolution permits more leisure and expands consumer markets to include the needs of children. In the mid to late 19th century, as the middle class emerged and grew larger, working class values shifted to emulate the middle class. This included the idea that children should be educated as soon as possible before entering the workforce, so as to have the best chance at being successful. In the first quarter of the 19th century, labor laws limiting the work hours of children in France to 8 hours a day if the child was under 10, but laws mandating, and that's really crazy. Yeah. I really think that's crazy. But laws mandating public secular education for children aged 6 to 13 were not instituted in France until the 1880s. So I guess most of the kids, if they were home and not working in the factories, they were probably being homeschooled or helping their parents work. And these are kids working in factories. I don't think that this is in France. I couldn't find any, but basically they were in pretty sorry shape. So we're defining the fashion doll right now. Getting back to our subject, the fashion doll of the mid 1800s is a small figure, generally averaging in height from 12 to 24 inches, representing an adult, usually female, but sometimes male, dressed in contemporary clothes to represent the current fashions of the day. During the latter half of the 19th century in France, they were called poupées. They were also called poupées peau, or they were called poupées mode, or they were called poupées parisiennes. In English, we just call them fashion dolls. Previous to that time, the dolls and sometimes full-length mannequins, also called Pandoras, they were dressed in contemporary fashions of their time, and they were traded amongst the royals at the grand courts of Europe as early as the 14th century. I think I have some Pandoras here. Also quite popular in the 16th century, they were couriers of fashion, which were traded specifically between England and France. These could range in size from 36 inches to a full human dimension, and were often made of wood, wax, and papier-mâché. By the second half of the 19th century, the fashion doll era finally reached the masses, and dolls began to be marketed for children as well as adults. That's right about the time that one of the preeminent doll manufacturers in France began selling dolls. Back to Pierre-François Jumeau, our hero. So these are some of this is an actual advertising from when he first started in, I think it was 1844. He was partners with another fellow named Belton, and they made toys, and this is one of the advertisements of what they made, one of the few pieces that survived. Pierre-François Jumeau was the son of a fabric seller in the small town of Ramelard outside Paris, briefly associated with doll manufacturer Louis Désir Belton in Paris. He honed his skills producing dress dolls. Now, the first dress dolls were actually, you could not remove the dresses. The dresses were either nailed on or sewn on. So that was a later innovation. He distinguished himself in the field with honorable mention in 1844 Paris Industrial Exposition and decided to strike out on his own. This would prove to be the beginning of the most prolific doll manufacturer in France and perhaps all of Europe, the Jumeau Doll Company. Initially, circa 1845 to 1855, the Jumeau Company produced mostly dressed lady dolls for export because the French market was not able to support the volume that Jumeau produced. He benefited from advertising and creating dolls of different periods. Now, these are prints that might have been available to him because this comes from a very old French book, and they are steel engravings that were hand colored, and they're really quite beautiful. And I'm sure that he was like referencing books with images like this to create his costume dolls. So he benefited from targeted advertising, creating dolls of different periods, from royal representations to regionally dressed dolls. And while the bodies and the heads appeared to represent adult figures, he often advertised and dressed his dolls in children's clothing, perhaps foreshadowing his ultimate intent. Since doll heads of quality were not yet being produced in France, the heads were mostly imported papier mache from Germany. These are some of the early French dolls. The one on the right we're going to talk about shortly. These have German papier mache heads, but the bodies made of kid skin, and they were dressed in France. I happen to have an example here tonight. Allegra is going to hold it up and show you a little bit about it. This is the close-up of the doll she's holding up. This is a remarkable antique doll and fairly hard one to find in this actually pretty good condition. We also have her clothes on the clothes stand there. It dates from about 1847. Collectors refer to this type of doll as a French papier mache. Most of these types of dolls have German papier mache shoulder heads, some with open mouths. She's got an open mouth with bamboo teeth. And I just love the way her body is sewn together. It's hand sewn. It's kid skin, but beautifully done. I think we can get a view of the butt, which is pretty prominent, and they give her little breasts. Very, very nice. And that was one of the first Jumeau dolls made with the German heads. And they were most likely produced, the heads that I'm talking about, by Andreas Voigt of Hildburghausen, Germany. Jumeau had great faith in his dressmakers, mostly women. Here's another one of the German, and we have another one. When you come up later, you can take a look at it. She's over here. So Jumeau had great faith in his dressmakers, mostly women, and he entrusted them to produce dolls of various nationalities and eras. He quickly distinguished the Jumeau firm with several awards, in which he clearly touted in his advertisements. The orders were flowing in. There's another papier mache head. The orders were flowing in even as the rest of France was struggling during the 1848 uprising. But instead of laying off his workers, he hired more and kept salaries steady. Pierre Françoise was a brilliant businessman with compassionate character as well as a great eye for fashion. Starting in the 1840s, all the way through the turn of the century, fashion magazines like La Poupée, Modèle, La Mode Illustrée, Godey's Fashions in the States were becoming very popular sources of fashion information. We're passing out some actual images and plates from some of these magazines that you can actually take a close look at. They had superb illustrations in steel engravings and hand-tinted colors. La Poupée Modèle, first published in 1863, was dedicated to dressing fashion dolls. These publications were targeted at young women and teens. La Poupée Modèle was very popular. It was conceived by a Parisian businesswoman named Madame Levalet-Perron and published monthly. So what they did is they had like these were like paper dolls that you could dress, and there was also patterns that you could make. So it was definitely geared to a young female audience. These were some samples of the hats and the hairdos and the hair ornaments. Dolls were a major part of the magazine's appeal. Each issue had patterns for doll clothing, so readers could sew a trousseau for their doll. While deep in the zeitgeist of this growing popularity for fashion dolls, Jumeau continued his very successful export business and soon became well respected and trusted in the industry. He had a keen sense of what the market demanded and acted on this. He also was in contact with other up and coming French doll producers like Adelaide Calix Ture and her sister Leontine Hure, as well as Casimir Bru, François Gaultier, Blanpois. These are some dolls made by his competitors, but really excellent and beautiful dolls. In fact, the Hure dolls are highly sought after, and I was just looking up some of the auction prices paid for. Now these are all Hure Poupées. I think one of them went for like $60,000 not too long ago. So they're really very rare because they were only in business for a limited amount of time. They were very innovative and they did great work. And they were gearing their dolls towards the education of young girls. And so their dolls don't really look like fashion ladies. They look more like girls. Their dresses were a little shorter. And they made all the clothes themselves and they designed the bodies and they innovated a lot of the ways that the dolls were articulated. These are some of the Hure dresses. They go for a few $100s each, sometimes $1,000 for an original Hure dress. Now, here you can note that the children's dresses have shorter skirts than the grown ups. And that was a style that was really celebrated in the magazines. And then I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, but before that, children were dressed basically like their parents. They were like little grown ups. And now the children are having clothes that are freer. The Hure sisters promoted their dolls as educational tools for young girls to learn the skills of dressmaking. They often dressed their dolls in children's fashions called enfantine, representing young girls as opposed to women. The modeling of the heads as well was less mature looking. Jumeau took note and started dressing his dolls accordingly. Here is a beautiful Roma doll. Now, Roma was another doll producer of the period who was actually creating dolls at the same time as Hure. And Roma also was an innovative lady who created the swivel neck. And this is one of her early dolls. So some of these heads are porcelain with a glaze over them. So you might call them China dolls, but they were also well painted and had glass eyes. But as you can see, the head is not swiveling yet, it's a stiff neck. And it has a whole collection of clothing that was probably made by an older child or a mother. All right, so here's the Godey's Ladies book. Meanwhile, the technology of doll making was rapidly changing in the 1850s. Artists were creating porcelain adult heads representing the Empress Eugenie de Montijo, wife of Napoleon III, who ruled France from 1853 to 1870. Porcelain and bisque doll heads came into fashion and they were being produced in France, many of them representing the idealized face of Empress Eugenie. Jumeau was not making his own heads, but buying them. And you can see the comparison between the porcelain heads made in France. The one on the left is a Hure head, and one of the German Voigt dolls. While Jumeau quickly switched to these more appealing French made porcelain heads, he did not make them himself, but bought them from makers like Barrois and Blanpois and Gaultier. Now he no longer depended on the German papier mache heads for his poupées. The German toy industry was losing control of the doll market, and that was bad. Bad for the Germans. They took notice and took action. So there were also new innovations in the doll market. This could have been, I couldn't find a picture, a wooden mannequin that was made by Albert Frederic and Marie Victoire in 1865, but they had a patent on it, and I think it was a pretty long patent, although most patents at that time were reasonable. While not actually plagiarizing the idea, Jumeau decided to produce a fully articulated wooden doll. This is actually a doll in my collection. It's huge. It's like 33 or 34 inches. It's a kid over wood body. This was a great innovation in the doll world. A lot of people were making fully articulated wooden dolls, and we have actually one of them here. Actually, two. We have also a bébé body, which I will talk to you about at the end. A note here on the French patents. At the time, many patents protected innovations for original designers, but not for long. One only had to buy their time for as little as 5 years before incorporating the new intellectual design into one's production. Cases in point the development of the swivel head by Roma, the articulated wooden mannequin body that we just spoke about, and the use of ball joints for articulation of doll bodies. All these innovations were copyright protected and were used by Jumeau when they moved into the public domain. So far, I have mostly spoken about Pierre-François Jumeau, but in 1873, after the sudden and unpredictable death of his elder son George, Pierre-François' second son, Émile Louis Jumeau, began assuming management of the company. This position was originally promised to George, but now Émile had to become responsible. He quickly wed the daughter of a wine merchant, Ernestine Stephanie Ducru. I can't pronounce that one. And he was given gradual control of the company by his dad. Émile Louis rose to the occasion and proved to be a perfect success. This has nothing to do with Jumeau, but under his son's leadership, Pierre's vision of creating a bébé Jumeau was finally realized. It's not to say that bébé Jumeau was the first bébé doll on the French market. Actually, Jules Nicolas Steiner was the first French doll maker to create an articulated bébé head and bébé body with his patented bébé parlant in 1862. So this is actually the first bébé doll. But eventually that patent expired and many French doll makers jumped in. Émile's bébés were different in that their proportions were more realistic, whereas Poupées had heads 1/7 the length of the body, the bébés had heads 1/5 the length of the body. The sculptors at Jumeau were seriously noting the actual proportions of the humans and reflecting those proportions on the construction of the bébé dolls. Additionally, bébés did not have slender waist, as did the corseted fashions. So you can see the difference of the proportions. You can see the bébé doll has a much broader and chunkier body, whereas the fashion doll is kind of like an old style Barbie doll, incredibly unhumanly thin. The bébé doll you will notice is on the end of the table there. It's a tête Jumeau, and we'll look at it later, but you're seeing her in the nude now. But Émile did not work alone. His talented wife, Ernestine, directed the dressmakers to produce a wonderful line of doll clothes unmatched in detail and style by Jumeau's competitors. The charm of the Jumeau line was celebrated far and wide. Virtually every French doll manufacturer was now producing bébé dolls, but their clothes could not compare. The bébés not only fulfilled a global growing need, but entirely changed the public view on the child. No longer an accessory to the financial advancement of the family, the child was now becoming an active participant in the economy, not as a worker or earner, but as a consumer, of course, through the pocket of their parents. By 1877, Émile ushered in the production of the bébé incassable, that means unbreakable. And really, if you dropped it, the head would break. So I don't know where he got that name. But he needed a new angle, so he called it bébé incassable. Gaining many awards for the quality and quantity of doll production, Émile and Ernestine worked together introducing the première bébé, also known as the portrait bébé or the bébé incassable. Then Carrière-Belleuse, who was a wonderful sculptor of the time, was commissioned by Jumeau to make a head. And now we call that the bébé triste, or the sad bébé. It's really a very beautiful Jumeau head, very ethereal. This is just, not just, it's a beautiful tête Jumeau. So the most prolific production of the Jumeau company was the tête Jumeau in about 1878. By 1878, Émile Louis Jumeau took leadership of the Jumeau factory, and Pierre François retired to his country home. Oh, here is the tête Jumeau that we have here on display as well. Jumeau fashion dolls continued to be fashionably dressed in the styles popular at the time and often had shapely, mature figures. Ernestine was the head designer of the Jumeau costumes, and she helped elevate the production of Jumeau fashion dolls and now bébé dolls to the next level. In 1878, the company was awarded the gold medal at the Paris exhibition, an honor which was proudly advertised on all of their products. So they stamped the butts with the médaille d'or, which is the gold medal, and later they got the diplôme d'honneur, and they had a oval sticker for those later dolls. Further awards followed, the international exhibitions in Sydney in 1879 and Melbourne in 1880. By this time, Jumeau's French competitors were hot on his heels with their own bébé dolls. So these are François Gaultier, Bru, and Steiner bébés that were competing at about the same time with the tête Jumeau. And you have to admit, they're, equally beautiful, I think. The golden age of the company spanned the period from the late 1870s to the 1890s, when the company employed over 200 workers with an annual output of 100,000 dolls. Most of the employees were women. Émile Louis became a Knight of the Legion d'Honneur in 1889. At that point, he met Henri Lioré, a French watchmaker and pioneer in the manufacture of talking machines, which helped the firm develop the bébé phonograph, the talking doll, in 1894. Unfortunately, a lot of these don't work. I've had several of them. I only had one that partially worked. But it was a great idea, and it followed closely with the Edison talking doll. I think the Edison was probably first. The plant at Montreuil, outside Paris, put together finely featured heads with glass eyes, now produced in-house. And they also supplied most of the eyes for the French bébés and poupées in the industry. These are like the beautiful French Jumeau eyes. They're really incredible. I decided to give a real close-up look of it. French doll makers were eventually forced to close down production due to the fierce competition from German manufacturers. They produced similar dolls at lower prices. These are all German knockoffs. And captured much of the French and foreign markets. Cheaper German dolls were flooding the markets in the 1890s, some of which were direct imitations of Jumeau's and Bru's, as well as the top-selling French bébés. Here I added a few pictures of mostly women working in the factories. This looks like a Jumeau factory because those heads look very familiar. Some more women working on dolls, dressing them. That is a familiar bébé chemise. And here they are actually working at lathes that are turning wood, probably for the body parts, maybe the balls. So a lot of the body parts of the Jumeaus were composition, but some parts were made of wood and they would turn them on lathes. And it's interesting to see women doing this work. In this one, women are painting lashes. Now, there was something that I read a long time ago. I'm going to mention it because I found it in the Jumeau book as well, that Jumeau had small girls from Italy, and I don't think this part is true, but I found out in the book that he did get girls up to the age of 10 to paint the lashes, but he was like, people complained about him because these girls could only work for a few years and then they would go blind. So it was kind of sad. And that's part of like the child labor at the time. I guess they only worked at it for 8 hours, but it's sad. As a final attempt at economic survival, the French doll and toy industry joined forces as the Société Française de Fabrication de Bébés et Jouets. Say that 3 times. It's called the SFBJ. When the Jumeau Company finally wound up its business in 1899, the remaining stock was taken over by SFBJ. This included large numbers of bébés, heads, bodies, costumes, and other components, making attribution to the Jumeau or SFBJ extremely difficult, and the dolls that were turned out during this transition period. That is why it is possible nowadays to find a François Gaultier head on a signed Jumeau body. Ironically, one of the co-directors of the SFBJ turned out to be a German producer of mostly toys who had operated in France for several years. His name was Solomon Fleischmann. This is a picture of the factory in 1890. And on the right, you can see a group picture of all of the workers at the Jumeau factory. And most of them are women. I only counted about 4 men when I looked at it very closely. And here I thought I would give you a little gallery of some of the beautiful dolls produced in this period. Some of them are fashion poupées and some of them are bébés. This is the famous Paris bébé, which you can read about. I mean, there was just too much to cover. That is a tête jumeau. That is a brou bébé, an all original jumeau in a factory dress, probably made by Ernestine. This is a beautiful large, I think, François Gaultier. Another Huret in a beautiful enfantine dress. This costume is very interesting. It's like a 18th century example, but I don't know if that's original or just a fantasy costume made by somebody, but I thought it was nice. Another Huret. You can tell I have fallen in love with Hurets during this preparation. Thank you so much. So now I would like to take a few minutes to talk about the display. So I've kind of arranged them in chronological order. So right here we have a paper mache by the German company, just the head, but it was a body and a doll made by Jumeau, assembled by Jumeau from the very early days in the 1840s. This may be a Jumeau, but it's very similar. It's in a regional costume, all original. The hat is a replacement. She needed a hat. This is a beautiful Romer doll with porcelain arms and a porcelain shoulder head, very nice with the original wig. There are some patches on the body. The body is stuffed. Sometimes they were stuffed with horsehair, and sometimes they were stuffed with wood chips. She also is wearing her original shoes. This is one of the French early regional dress dolls, but she is a fashion doll with a swivel head and beautiful glass eyes in original clothes. This is a gorgeous body. It's wood with wonderful articulation, bisque arms, bisque shoulder plate. A very nice early body, probably for a Romer. This is one of my favorite dolls in my personal collection. It's a smiling brew fashion in a beautiful antique fashion silk dress. And she's got a bunch of accessories, which I've given her over the years, but they are period appropriate. And I think she's quite beautiful. She's got a little bit of a smile and a beautiful antique book and purse. This is another smiling brew fashion here, but this one is dressed in an enfantine style. Quite lovely. Um, this is a very rare Doliac doll, another a manufacturer that only was in business for, a few years, maybe 10 years. From 1882, I have to read the tags. In a beautiful original dress, but unusually she's on a cloth body. And they did have cloth bodies, and sometimes the heads were sold without a body, and the mother would make the body, or they would have the body made by a professional. Um, and she's really quite nice. And I believe she's been wearing this dress for at least 150 years. It's got some moth holes. um, this is a Techimo bébé in original factory chemise, probably a later production. Um, well, you'll have to come up and take a look at it if you can't see it, but quite nice. We added the bonnet, and the shoes probably have replaced buckles. And she's got a little name pin from the same period. Her name is Delphine. Now, coming to the front pieces, we have here a beautiful all wood articulated body for a bébé. And you can see the difference between the bébé body and the fashion body. It's much chunkier, it's got kind of a pot belly, and it probably took a good size head. I'm still waiting for that head to turn up. It's a beautiful brew bébé. And then I brought this is another unmarked Techimo. She has a little damage between the eyes. But I brought her because you could really appreciate the eyes. The eyes were made in the factory and really beautifully done. And again, mostly women were working on these, and they are very human looking. Maybe that's part of the creep factor. Over here, this little child is made by Steiner and very, very cute. I like little dolls. And this is a size 2 Techimo. And you can see on her back the stamp from the Médaille d'Or award. Now, everybody's excited about the Lambert automaton, so I'm going to put the mic down, wind it up, and play it for you. Now, the head was made by Jumeau, but actually, this was the Lambert company was making a lot of other automatons. So it's kind of in a different category than the dolls. But it's beautifully made. The head was probably designed, they probably made a small run of those heads. And they didn't, mass produce these. They were probably also by special order. Now, a lot of people call them Chinese, but I think they might be not Chinese or maybe a particular Asian culture because she has very, very distinctive features. And also the skin tone is different. And I know that this is the original outfit because I've seen other ones on the market and they all have this particular dress or robe. Okay, does anybody have any questions? Thank you. Okay.
Imagine these were very expensive to buy when they were new.
I guess when they were new, they were probably very expensive for sure, especially if they were fully dressed. If they were sold with a chemise like this one, which is just for modesty, it's a very simple undergarment. And it was probably half the price of the dress doll because it took so much work to really create a beautiful dress like you saw in the ads that he was putting out and the little bébés that I showed also. Okay,
Thank you so much. This was very interesting.
thank you.
I was wondering about it seems like many of the dolls in your presentation and on display have very fair coloring in terms of light blonde or red hair and very light colored eyes. I was wondering if that was meant to reflect some sort of societal ideal or if there was a practical consideration in that. Just the thought process, if you have any information about that.
I feel that it was a common ideal of the period. Also, I have found as a doll dealer that getting a blue eyed doll with blonde hair sells much faster than a brown eyed doll with brown hair. And that's just the case, unfortunately.
Hi, here, let me bring the mic to you.
Did the couture industry get involved in having these sponsored or something as far as showcasing their clothing?
Can you repeat that question? I didn't get the
Did
beginning.
the couture hair
Yeah.
industry at the time in France, did they use the doll making in any way to sponsor some of their fashion of the time?
That is a question that I don't know the answer to. I apologize for that.
I'm curious how you store your personal doll collection, and I'm also curious if any of the original packaging exists or if you know anything about how they were packaged.
Well, the Jumeau dolls came in marked Jumeau boxes. I do have some of those boxes. I do have a couple of pieces in my personal collection that sit in their box. Usually it's open. It's really hard for the boxes to travel through time. You know, they were like the first pieces that were probably discarded. You know, especially if somebody played with the doll and had it in a display case. They probably had the box somewhere in the top of a closet. And when they moved, they forgot it. Not that many boxes survive, but when they do, it's very interesting. I store my dolls mostly in cabinets.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had a question about the numbers. Do we have any idea what kind of production we're talking about? Because you showed these images of what looked like kind of industrial scale, where there's many people working on like an assembly line kind of thing. So do we know how many were produced, how many were sold, like literally the size of the market, the scale of the market?
We do have information on that. By the way, it's good that you asked that question because Pierre François Jumeau was one of the innovators in the assembly line. He did start assembly lines in France, and that really helped make him a successful doll producer. And that's why I think some of those images are from the Jumeau factory. Yeah, and I think they had a tremendous scale. I mean, I think I mentioned in my lecture that there was a production of 100,000 dolls a year. That's kind of a lot of dolls, considering that what is the demand, and really, although it was reaching the working class and the middle class, not many people could afford them. So to produce that much, and the reason is that a lot of them were coming to America. They were going to Australia. They were going all over the world. Jameau made a lot of his money with export.
Thank you. I'm thinking back to the beginning of your talk when you gave us those two anecdotes of your own taxi trauma of the
Yeah,
doll, and then fishing some out of the dumpster. And to me, it just made me think about the importance of being able to connect these objects to specific people and specific memories and specific types of actions. Are there dolls circulating in the market that retain, in a sense, provenance information of specific owners or specific family, generational transfers that would allow us to
absolutely.
do sort of
There
serious
are.
social history without, in order to give specificity to generalizations?
Yes, there are. And I find a lot of these where you see the original owner of the doll in an old photograph with the doll. Yeah. And of course, that was probably handed down to a relative. But yeah, there is provenance. I don't have any here that have provenance, though.
Um, you mentioned Carrier Belleuse. He was the artistic director of Selz. So, did Selz get involved in making porcelain heads for the dolls?
I think it was just the one doll that he did with Jameau. I think it was a one-off deal with Jameau. My friend Nina works with information. She works in an antique shop that carries a lot of Carrier Belleuse sculptures. Maybe she could answer you. She's right in front of you.
I spoke to the curator of the Selz show at BGC and asked about the porcelain dolls, and they said sort of a definitive no in terms of if they'd ever made any.
And as a corollary to the lady's question about couturier, so is there a relationship between these miniature mannequins to real full-size mannequins?
That's a good question. There were the François Gaultier factory did do mannequins for window displays. Sometimes it was just a head, and sometimes it was a full size figure on a wooden articulated body. Yes, they did make mannequins.
Hi, how are you? I'm Eliza Mendes. I'm actually a specialist with antique dolls, houses, and miniatures.
Oh, hi.
Nice to meet you. Oh, sorry. I'm a specialist with antique dolls, houses, and miniatures. But my question to you is about the fabrics because I'm working on something where very small fabrics. I'm trying to find, was there a factory that created these very teeny fabrics just for this particular company? And here I'm wondering, were there factories that were making fabrics that were the scale for the dolls, specifically for the dolls, like for instance, wallpapers and doll houses end up being wallpaper scraps that somebody had in their attic. So fabrics here, they're specific. Were they specifically making the fabrics?
I don't think that I'm qualified to answer that, but I can tell you that I do spend a lot of time in French flea markets, and I do buy fabrics that I use to restore the dolls sometimes.
Right.
And they are incredibly beautiful. Did I know what they were originally intended to make? No, but I know that they're very fine. They have beautiful silks, they have brocades, they have velvets, silk velvets, beautiful, beautiful fabrics are still out there today, and you can get them.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, several of your shots have dolls almost leaning on miniature furniture. There was a spectacular empire-style chair with gilded wings, etc. Do you also collect miniature doll furniture?
I have some, but I don't necessarily collect them. And a lot of those pictures come from the Theriol's antique doll catalogs that I used as reference because they have some of the most beautiful dolls, antique dolls, and they do sell furniture. So I would recommend that you look into Theriol's if you want to get more.
Great.
Where are the doll museums that are best? I know there's one in Kansas City. I don't know about this area or in Europe.
I know that I went to a beautiful automaton museum in Monaco. I went to the museum that used to be in Paris but is no longer there. Allegra, do you know about the Margaret Strong Museum? So I'm not really a museum goer for dolls.
Any other questions? Then please join me in thanking Kathy Libraty.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. You're welcome to come up and take a closer look, but please don't touch.